On a cold November night in 1997, a teenage girl stood near a bridge in British Columbia, bleeding and alone. Dozens of people had seen her just minutes earlier. Some had watched her get beaten. Others had walked away. What happened next wouldn't just become one of Canada's most disturbing youth crime cases. It would force an entire country to confront a question most people don't like asking. When violence happens in front of everyone, who is actually responsible? This is episode 29, Reena Virk, the murder that exposed Canada's bystander problem. Before the bridge, before the party, before anyone started talking about witnesses, trials, or responsibility, there was a 14-year-old girl trying unsuccessfully to find a place where she belonged. Her name was Reena Virk. To understand what happened to her, you have to resist the urge to start with violence, because the violence didn't begin that night. It only ended that night. Reena Virk lived in Saanich, British Columbia, a suburban municipality just outside Victoria. It was the kind of place where kids walked to school, neighbors recognized each other's cars, and nothing ever seemed urgent enough to feel dangerous. Reena's life didn't stand out in any dramatic way. That was part of the problem. She wasn't invisible, but she also wasn't clearly understood. Teachers knew her as emotional, peers knew her as awkward, adults knew her as troubled, but not in a way that triggered alarms. She existed in that dangerous middle space, noticed but not protected. From a distance, Reena looked like many teenagers struggling through adolescence. But when you move closer, when you look at the pattern instead of the individual moments, something else becomes visible, a slow accumulation of rejection. Reena was born into a family that practiced the Jehovah's Witness faith. In itself, that wasn't unusual, but it placed her slightly outside the dominant social rhythms of her peer group: school dances, birthday parties, casual dating. These were spaces Reena often navigated awkwardly, or not at all. She wanted inclusion, but she didn't always have the cultural fluency or social permission to access it. She also struggled academically and emotionally. She had conflicts at school. She clashed with authority. She sometimes exaggerated stories or told lies that were easy to disprove. To adults, these behaviors looked like attention-seeking. To peers, they looked like weakness, and weakness in adolescent social hierarchies rarely goes unpunished. By the mid-1990s, Reena had acquired something no teenager wants: a reputation. Not a single rumor, but a cloud of them. Stories about things she'd said, things she'd done, things she might have done. Some of these rumors contradicted each other. Some were exaggerated. Some were completely false. But that didn't matter. Reputation, once established, becomes self-sustaining. Every action is interpreted through it. Every mistake confirms it. Reena was no longer just Reena. She was that girl. And that girl is someone people feel licensed to mistreat. When people think of bullying, they often imagine clear roles: a bully and a victim, visible cruelty, obvious harm. What Reena experienced was messier. Sometimes she was excluded, sometimes mocked, sometimes drawn in, briefly, only to be pushed back out. The cruelty wasn't constant, which made it harder to name. It arrived in waves, quiet days followed by humiliating ones, moments of tentative belonging followed by sharp rejection. This inconsistency is psychologically destabilizing. It keeps people trying, keeps them hopeful, keeps them returning to spaces that have already proven unsafe. Reena didn't avoid people who hurt her. She kept showing up. Teachers and school administrators were aware that Reena struggled. There were disciplinary issues, emotional episodes, conflicts with peers, but these were treated as isolated incidents. No one assembled the timeline. No one stepped back far enough to see the pattern: escalating social hostility paired with emotional vulnerability. Reena wasn't flagged as at risk. She was flagged as difficult. And there's a difference. At-risk students trigger intervention. Difficult students trigger distance. It's tempting to ask why Reena didn't just walk away. Why she kept putting herself in situations where she wasn't wanted. That question misunderstands adolescence. At 14, peer acceptance isn't a luxury. It's a survival instinct. Being alone feels unbearable. Being excluded feels catastrophic. Reena wasn't chasing popularity. She was chasing belonging. And every time she thought she might finally have it, every invitation, every party, Every brief moment of inclusion, she took it, even when the cost was obvious in hindsight. In the weeks leading up to November 1997, tensions surrounding Reena intensified. There were accusations involving a stolen phone book, allegations that she had spread rumors, claims that she had betrayed confidences. Whether these accusations were true, exaggerated, or misunderstood is almost beside the point. What mattered was how they were received. Within the peer group, they became justification. They reframed Reena not as someone to avoid, but as someone who deserved consequences. This shift is critical. It transforms social cruelty into moral punishment. And once that transformation happens, restraint erodes quickly. No single person decided Reena should be hurt. Instead, something more subtle happened. Responsibility diluted itself. People talked, complained, shared stories, reinforced each other's perceptions. Each person contributed a small amount of hostility, not enough to feel guilty about on its own. Together, it became something far more dangerous. This is how group violence begins, not with rage, but with consensus. In the days before November 14th, Reena was emotionally unstable. She was upset, conflicted, desperate to repair damaged relationships. She reached out, tried to explain herself, tried to regain footing. There is no evidence she expected violence. There is every indication she expected another chance. That expectation, tragically, was reasonable based on her past experience. Conflicts had flared before. She had survived them. Life had moved on. Nothing in her history suggested this night would be different. When Reena learned about the gathering near Craigflower Bridge, it felt like an opportunity, a chance to be present, to be seen, to normalize things. From the outside, this decision looks reckless. From the inside, it looks inevitable. She went because staying home meant isolation. She went because absence would confirm rejection. She went because showing up was the only strategy she had left. By the time Reena left her house that evening, many of the forces that would shape what happened were already in motion. Not the violence itself, but the conditions that made it possible. A girl labeled as disposable. A group conditioned to see her as a problem. A community accustomed to looking away from adolescent cruelty. No one knew how the night would end. But many people had already decided, consciously or not, how much Reena mattered, and that decision would echo far beyond that evening. Reena Virk didn't walk toward Craigflower Bridge as a victim. She walked there as a teenager, hoping, one more time, that things might turn out differently. What waited for her wasn't sudden, it wasn't random, and it didn't begin that night. It had been forming for years. The next segment begins with the place itself, the bridge, the gathering, and the moment when tension finally tipped into violence. The place where it all happened mattered, not just because of where it was, but because of what it allowed. Craigflower Bridge sat low over the water on the edge of Saanich, ordinary enough to feel harmless and familiar to people who lived nearby. It wasn't remote wilderness, and it wasn't a supervised public space either. Teenagers had been drifting toward it for years because it occupied a comfortable middle ground. Close enough to neighborhoods to walk to, but far enough that noise didn't immediately carry. It felt like a place where nothing serious could happen, and that assumption shaped the night. On the evening of November 14th, 1997, the gathering near the bridge didn't resemble a party in any structured sense. There was no host, no invitation list, and no single decision that brought everyone together. One person mentioned it, another showed up, and others followed when they heard where people were gathering. Small clusters formed along the shoreline, breaking apart and reforming without direction. Some teens arrived briefly and left, while others lingered for hours. No one was in charge, and that absence of authority mattered. When authority is absent, informal power structures take over. Social hierarchies become more rigid, and small signals begin to carry outsized weight. Who stands with whom? Who gets laughed at, who is ignored, and who is tolerated, all become meaningful. By the time Reena Virk arrived, the atmosphere had already settled into something uneasy. It wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't neutral either. The tension was subtle, the kind that's easy to miss unless you're the one at the center of it. Reena didn't arrive to silence, she arrived to glances. Some people noticed her immediately, others pretended not to, and a few reacted with smirks or comments just loud enough to be heard. Several teenagers present that night would later be identified as participants in the first assault, though most cannot be publicly named due to protections under the Young Offenders Act. In court records and reporting, they are referred to only by initials or described as unnamed youths. At this stage, however, the hostility still looked informal and deniable. Nothing yet demanded intervention. The accusations that had been circulating for weeks resurfaced again. Claims about a stolen phone book, allegations of spreading rumors, and stories repeated so often they felt settled were brought back into the open. Reena responded defensively and emotionally, trying to explain herself and correct the record. Each attempt only reinforced the imbalance between her and the group. When one person speaks from isolation and the group responds with amusement or indifference, power shifts quickly. The group gains confidence and the individual loses leverage. What followed did not happen all at once. There was no single spark or dramatic turning point. Instead, the temperature rose gradually, almost imperceptibly. People edged closer, comments sharpened, and laughter changed tone, signaling permission rather than humor. At several points, Reena could have left, and so could others. But social gravity is powerful. Leaving means choosing a side, while staying allows people to believe they are neutral. As the evening progressed, the crowd thinned and thickened in waves. Some teenagers left and returned, while others arrived late and absorbed only fragments of what had already been said. Each retelling of the story about Reena sharpened it, adding detail and certainty. By the time physical aggression began, many people felt they already understood who Reena was and how they were supposed to feel about her. That sense of consensus mattered. It created an environment where violence felt like an extension of earlier behavior rather than a rupture. The first assault happened in public, in front of multiple witnesses. Reena was punched, kicked, and struck repeatedly by a group of teens, including several youths who cannot be named because they were under the age of 18 at the time. Court records later confirmed that more than one person participated in the beating. The violence was chaotic rather than coordinated, unfolding in bursts rather than as a sustained attack. Some people hesitated, others watched, and a few briefly intervened, creating pauses that made it seem as though it might be over. Reena was injured, shaken, but still standing. Because Reena remained conscious and vocal, many people downgraded what they had just seen. If she could stand, it must not have been that bad. If she was yelling, she must be okay. These assumptions formed quickly and allowed people to disengage. As individuals began to leave, responsibility diluted further. The group fractured, and what had been public violence receded into something people told themselves was finished. What followed depended on that belief. As the shoreline quieted, only a small number of people remained near Reena. Among them were two individuals who would later be convicted in connection with her death, while the others involved in the earlier assault faded back into anonymity protected by youth sentencing laws. The tone shifted again, becoming calm and conversational. Reena was told it was over, that the others were gone, and that nothing else was going to happen. Those assurances mattered because Reena wanted them to be true. The bridge still loomed nearby, cars passing overhead, the water moving quietly below. Ordinary sounds returned, reinforcing the illusion that danger had passed. Reena listened, responded, and stayed. From the outside, this moment looks like a clear turning point. From the inside, it felt like relief. She did not know that the night had only narrowed, not ended. The next segment begins with what happened after the crowd left, when assumptions hardened into certainty, and when responsibility narrowed from many to few in a way the law could no longer ignore. They didn't realize they had crossed into something irreversible until it was already happening. What had been sharp words and hostile glances turned physical in a way that felt sudden, even though it wasn't. The buildup had been long and the tension obvious, but when the first shove landed, it still startled people. Not enough to stop what came next, just enough to register that something had changed. Someone pushed Reena Virk hard enough to throw her off balance. She stumbled, caught herself, and shouted back. Her voice cut through the noise, high and strained, and that sound seemed to flip a switch. What followed wasn't organized. It was messy and uneven, with people surging forward and pulling back at the same time. Kelly Ellard struck Reena, and others moved in quickly. Warren Glowatsky was among those who joined the assault, along with several other teenagers whose names cannot be published because they were youths at the time. The violence escalated without anyone taking control. A punch, a kick, someone grabbing at her hair, someone else yelling for it to stop, but not loudly, not forcefully enough to take charge of the situation. The assault came in bursts rather than a steady rhythm, which made it harder to interrupt. Each pause created the illusion that it might be over. Each restart reinforced the sense that no one was really in charge. Reena tried to protect herself, raising her arms and twisting away. She was outnumbered, but not completely surrounded at first. People shifted constantly around her. Some stepped in close and struck her, while others hovered just behind, watching. That distinction mattered later, when everyone tried to remember what they had done and what they had only seen. Seen feels safer than done. The setting made it worse. The open shoreline, the bridge overhead, and the sense that this was a public place all suggested limits. It felt like the kind of place where things wouldn't go too far, where someone would intervene if they had to, but no one took responsibility for that role. When another blow landed, the group reacted not with shock, but with noise. Shouting, laughter, overlapping voices filled the space where judgment should have been. Sound drowned out the part of the brain that asks whether this is okay. Violence became background noise instead of a line being crossed. Reena went down at one point, not flat, but low enough that people had to adjust around her. That should have been the moment everything snapped back into focus. For some, it briefly did. A few people hesitated. Someone stepped between bodies for a moment, disrupting the rhythm of the attack. That interruption mattered, not because it stopped the violence, but because it changed how it would later be remembered. Many people would later say the fight was broken up, that someone intervened, that it didn't last long. Those statements weren't lies. They were partial truths. The assault didn't end so much as it loosened. The intensity dipped and people stepped back. Reena got to her feet. She was injured and visibly shaken, but upright, still yelling, still conscious. That image, Reena standing, became a kind of permission slip. If she could stand, then maybe it hadn't been that bad. If she was yelling, then maybe she was okay. If it was over, then maybe no one needed to do anything else. This is how people downgrade violence in real time. Someone said it was done. Someone else repeated it. The idea spread faster than the truth ever could. The crowd relaxed just slightly, and adrenaline began to bleed off. The moment lost its urgency. People began to leave, not all at once, one or two at a time. Someone checked the time. Someone said they should go. Someone didn't want to be around if police showed up. Each departure made the next one easier. Leaving felt reasonable. Staying felt uncomfortable. What didn't feel urgent to most people was making sure Reena wasn't left behind. No one gathered around her to walk her home. No one called an adult. No one insisted she leave with them. The assumption was that someone else would handle it, or that she could handle herself, or that the situation had already resolved. Assumptions multiplied in the absence of responsibility. As the group thinned, the violence receded in memory, even though it had just happened. People began rewriting the event almost immediately, smoothing over its edges and compressing it into something easier to live with. It was just a fight. She was involved too. It didn't last that long. These narratives formed while Reena was still standing there, injured and trying to process what had just happened. When the shoreline finally grew quieter, the night seemed to reset. The noise dropped. The chaos faded. The bridge returned to being just a bridge. That shift was dangerous because it suggested closure where there was none. Reena was not safe. She was not okay. She had not been protected. She had simply survived the first phase. And survival can be misleading. Two people remained near her, familiar faces, not strangers, people she recognized and trusted enough to believe when they spoke calmly now. They were Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. They told her it was over. Those words mattered more than any blow that night. They reframed the violence as something finished, something that belonged to the past few minutes rather than the present moment. They gave Reena permission to stand down, to stop bracing herself, to believe she could breathe again. The crowd that might have intervened was gone. The witnesses who might have complicated what happened next were already walking home, rehearsing how they would describe the night. What remained was quiet, exhaustion, and trust, misplaced but understandable. The first assault ended not with accountability, but with dispersal, not with protection, but with abandonment. And because it happened in public, because so many people saw parts of it, Many assumed it could not lead to something worse. They were wrong. The violence that followed would not be loud enough to draw attention. It would not be chaotic enough to invite interruption. It would not happen in front of a crowd that could later argue about what they had seen. It would happen without witnesses. Silence followed. Not the calm kind, but the hollow kind. The kind that settles after noise has drained away and leaves everything exposed. The shoreline was no longer crowded, and the bridge no longer felt like a gathering place. Whatever protection visibility had offered during the earlier assault was gone. The witnesses had left. The noise had faded. What remained was isolation. Reena was still there. She was injured, exhausted, and emotionally raw from the beating she had just endured. The adrenaline that had carried her through the public assault had begun to wear off, replaced by shock and fatigue. Her body was slowing down, even as her mind struggled to catch up with what had happened. She had survived the worst part, or so it seemed. Two people stayed with her. They were Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky, teenagers she knew from the same social circles as the others who had attacked her earlier. Their voices were calm now. There was no yelling, no chaos, no crowd reacting to every movement. That shift mattered, because calm can feel like care when someone is overwhelmed and desperate for stability. They told her the others were gone, that the fight was over, that nothing else was going to happen. Those assurances landed because Reena needed them to be true. From her perspective, the most dangerous part of the night had already happened in public. It had been loud, humiliating, and violent, and she had survived it. What followed felt like aftermath, not escalation. She had no reason in that moment to believe she was in greater danger than she had already endured. That misreading would cost her everything. Ellard and Glowatsky began moving away from the bridge, toward the water, and Reena followed. The shoreline was uneven, dark, and quiet. At night, distance is deceptive. What feels like a short walk can quickly become isolation. With every step, there were fewer lights, less sound, and no one else in view. This is often where people ask why Reena didn't run, or scream, or fight back sooner. That question assumes clarity. It assumes she understood what was about to happen. She didn't. She had just been told it was over. The human body responds to reassurance. Stress hormones drop, muscles loosen, vigilance fades, exhaustion takes over. These reactions are automatic, not choices. And by the time the violence resumed, Reena was already depleted. What happened next was not chaotic. There was no audience now, no group energy, no need to perform. The violence that followed was deliberate and controlled. Kelly Ellard attacked Reena again, this time away from the bridge and out of view of others. Warren Glowatsky participated by holding Reena down, preventing her from escaping as the assault continued. The water was close. Reena was beaten and forced into the shallow inlet near the shoreline. She was injured, disoriented, and physically overpowered. In that condition, even shallow water became deadly. Reena Virk drowned there, alone, with no one left to intervene. Later, forensic evidence would document the extent of her injuries, bruising, trauma, and signs of force that confirmed the violence had not ended with the crowd dispersing. The medical findings would make clear what the silence of the shoreline could not describe. When it was over, the shoreline returned to stillness. No one called for help. No one reported what had happened. Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky left the area, and the night closed in around the place where Reena was left. Then, for a time, nothing happened. Reena did not come home. At first, her absence did not trigger immediate alarm. Teenagers sometimes stay out late. Conflicts are assumed to blow over. People assume someone else knows where the missing person is. Time passed under those assumptions. When concern finally reached authorities, the initial assumption was not homicide. It was accident, or misadventure, or something unintentional. Early search efforts reflected that belief. The area near the bridge was checked, the shoreline examined, but urgency lagged behind reality. Days later, Reena's body was found in the water, not far from where the gathering had taken place. That discovery changed everything. What had been treated as a missing person case became a death investigation. What had been dismissed as teenage drama began to look like something far darker. The fight that was broken up, the assumption that it was over, and the belief that someone else would step in all collapsed under scrutiny. Attention returned to the gathering near Craigflower Bridge. Investigators began asking questions many people had hoped would never be asked. Who was there? What was seen? Who left? And who stayed? Memories that had been smoothed over in the days following the night were suddenly under pressure. Timelines mattered. Silences mattered. The shoreline, once ordinary and forgettable, returned to public view with a new meaning. It was no longer just a hangout spot. It was a place where assumptions had failed. Reena Virk had not disappeared. She had been left. And the consequences of that abandonment were now impossible to ignore. The investigation didn't begin with certainty. It began with gaps. Police were not immediately handed a clear crime scene, a single suspect, or a straightforward timeline. What they were handed instead was a place many people had passed through, a night described differently by nearly everyone who had been there, and a victim who had already been discussed and dismissed long before she was found. The first challenge investigators faced was undoing assumptions. Early theories leaned toward accident. The water was shallow, the shoreline uneven. It was easier at first to imagine a fall than an assault, but that theory collapsed quickly under examination. Reena's injuries told a different story. The bruising, the trauma, the pattern of harm, none of it aligned with an accidental drowning. What investigators were now dealing with was a homicide that had occurred in proximity to a large group of witnesses. That fact should have simplified things. It didn't. Interviews began with teenagers who had been present at the bridge that night. Some were cooperative, others were defensive. Many claimed limited memory. Stories overlapped in places and contradicted each other in others. No one described themselves as central. People minimized their proximity. They emphasized when they arrived and how quickly they left. They described seeing something, but not enough to act. They remembered sound without clarity, movement without detail. A pattern emerged early. Everyone knew something, but no one claimed to know enough. Investigators began reconstructing the night piece by piece. Who arrived first? Who stayed longest? Who left together? Who remained after the crowd thinned? Timelines became critical. So did pressure. As more statements were taken, inconsistencies surfaced. Some teens changed their accounts. Others admitted to downplaying what they had seen. A few acknowledged they had been afraid of retaliation, afraid of being blamed, afraid of being pulled into something they didn't think was their responsibility. That fear had consequences. The longer silence held, the harder it became to separate truth from self-protection. Eventually, focus narrowed. Two individuals emerged as central to what happened after the crowd dispersed. Their names surfaced repeatedly, not as background figures, but as the last people seen with Reena. At the same time, investigators could not ignore the first assault. Multiple people had participated. Multiple people had witnessed it. The law had to decide where responsibility began and ended. Charges followed. Several teenagers were charged in connection with the initial beating. The legal distinction was important. The first assault was violent, but it was not the act that caused Reena's death. That difference would shape everything that came next. Two individuals were charged with murder, Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. What followed was not a single trial, but a prolonged legal process that stretched over years. Testimony was challenged, verdicts were appealed, convictions overturned and retried. For the public, this was exhausting. For Reena's family, it was relentless. Each court appearance reopened the night. Each appeal forced the case back into motion, just as it seemed to settle. The legal system moved deliberately, but to many observers, it felt slow and fragile, as if justice itself were uncertain. One of the most difficult aspects of the trials was the contrast between moral responsibility and legal proof. Many people believed more individuals should have been held accountable. The law disagreed. It could only address what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That gap left lasting frustration. The teens convicted for the first assault received sentences that reflected their roles, but for many, those outcomes felt inadequate. The crowd that made the violence possible largely returned to anonymity. The murder convictions carried life sentences, but even those were shaped by youth sentencing laws, parole eligibility, and ongoing appeals. Justice in this case did not arrive as a single moment of resolution. It arrived in fragments, spread across years. As details from the trials became public, the narrative of the night changed again. The idea that it was just a fight collapsed completely. The notion that it had been handled by the group was exposed as wishful thinking. What replaced those narratives was something far more uncomfortable, a clear understanding that the violence had unfolded in stages, enabled by inaction and finalized in silence. The investigation did more than identify perpetrators. It forced a reckoning with how many chances there had been to stop what happened, and how many of those chances were missed. By the time the legal process reached its final outcomes, the case had already changed the country's conversation. But for those closest to it, that change came at an irreversible cost. This case altered the public consciousness, and it continues to be taught and debated, and Reena Virk's name still carries weight decades later. The case did not end when the verdicts were handed down. Long before the legal process finished, the murder of Reena Virk had already shifted how people talked about youth violence in Canada. What unsettled the public wasn't only that a teenager had been killed, it was how many people had been present along the way, and how ordinary the setting had been. This was not a crime hidden in isolation from the start. It unfolded in plain sight. For many Canadians, that realization was deeply uncomfortable. It challenged the belief that violence announces itself clearly, that danger is obvious, that someone will always step in. The Reena Virk case showed something else entirely, that harm can grow gradually, fueled by social permission and sustained by silence. Schools, parents, and policymakers began using the case as a reference point, not as a cautionary tale about a single bad actor, but as an example of what happens when bullying becomes normalized and responsibility diffuses across a group. The language around youth violence changed. Terms like swarm violence entered public discussion. The idea that bystanders play a role, not just morally, but practically, gained traction. It became harder to dismiss inaction as neutrality. Educational programs began referencing the case when discussing bullying, peer pressure, and accountability. Teachers used it to illustrate how social dynamics escalate, how exclusion can become punishment, and how quickly situations can move beyond anyone's control. The case also exposed the limits of the justice system when dealing with group harm. Many people continued to struggle with the outcomes. Some felt the sentences were too lenient. Others questioned how many individuals had avoided legal consequences entirely. The gap between what felt right and what could be proven remained a point of tension. That tension never fully resolved. Reena's family became advocates, not by choice, but by necessity. Their grief was public. Their endurance was scrutinized. Over time, their voices helped redirect attention back to what mattered, not the spectacle of the crime, but the human cost. Media coverage evolved as well. Early reporting had focused on shock and sensational details. Later examinations became more reflective, more cautious. Journalists revisited the case to ask harder questions about how stories are framed, whose voices are amplified, and how narratives can obscure responsibility rather than clarify it. The location itself changed in meaning. Craigflower Bridge was no longer just a local landmark. It became shorthand for a failure, not of law enforcement, but of collective judgment, a place where ordinary assumptions collapsed under scrutiny. Years passed, new cases emerged, public attention shifted. But Reena Virk's name continued to surface in discussions about bullying, youth justice, and bystander responsibility. The case resisted closure because it didn't offer easy answers. It refused to be simplified. It asked something of everyone who learned about it. What would you have done? When would you have stepped in? At what point does watching become participating? Those questions don't fade with time. They become more pressing as social spaces expand, as crowds move online, as visibility increases without accountability. Reena's story persists not because it is shocking, but because it is familiar. The dynamics that led to her death still exist. They look different now, but they operate the same way, through exclusion, rumor, silence, and gradual escalation. Remembering her means resisting the urge to treat this as a historical anomaly. It means recognizing patterns when they form, not after they end. The legacy of the case is not found in legal precedent alone. It lives in the discomfort it creates, the refusal to let bystanders off the hook, the insistence that responsibility does not disappear just because it is shared. Reena Virk's life was brief. The consequences of how it ended were not. Reena Virk didn't disappear in the dark. She was surrounded. She was seen. and still she was left behind. Her story isn't only about violence. It's about what happens when responsibility spreads so thin that no one feels it belongs to them, when silence feels safer than speaking up, when walking away feels easier than stepping in. The night near the bridge ended years ago. The questions it raised have not. Reena was 14 years old. She deserved protection. She deserved to be believed. She deserved to come home. And remembering her means refusing to look away when it matters most, to be a good Samaritan and to take care of each other. Before we wrap up our episode, I want to step back from the details of this case for a moment, because as disturbing as Reena Virk's story is, what makes it linger is how familiar the dynamics are, not the violence itself, but the social conditions around it.
Yeah, and what struck me listening back is how little of this looks like a single bad decision. It looks like something that builds slowly. The exclusion, the rumors, the way a person becomes isolated over time, those are things a lot of teenagers experience, even if they never talk about them.
And that's the part that worries me most. When people hear a case like this, there's a tendency to treat it as extreme or exceptional. But the early stages aren't extreme at all. They're ordinary. They're hallway dynamics, group chats, who's in, who's out.
Exactly. And teenagers don't usually say, I'm being bullied. They say things like, I don't want to go to school, or everyone hates me, or sometimes nothing at all. Withdrawal often shows up before anyone labels what's happening to them.
One of the hardest truths here is that adults often notice pieces, but not the pattern. A change in mood, a conflict at school, a sudden shift in friend groups. Each thing on its own feels manageable. Together, they can signal real distress.
And kids who are struggling socially don't always look like what we expect. They're not always quiet or withdrawn. Sometimes they're reactive, emotional, defensive. That can make adults misread the situation as a behavior problem instead of a vulnerability problem.
Which is exactly what happened here. Reena wasn't invisible. She was visible, but framed as difficult. And when a teenager gets that label, support tends to pull back instead of move closer.
For parents, one of the biggest red flags isn't just sadness, it's inconsistency. Big emotional swings, desperation to be included, staying in friendships or social spaces that clearly hurt them. That can be a sign that the fear of being alone feels worse than being mistreated.
Another thing to watch for is secrecy that's new, not normal privacy, but sudden reluctance to talk about friends, avoidance of specific names, or anxiety around social events that used to feel normal.
And parents shouldn't underestimate how powerful group dynamics are. Teenagers are wired to prioritize peer acceptance. That doesn't mean parents have failed if their child is struggling. It means the pressure is real and sometimes overwhelming.
This case also forces a conversation about bystanders, not just teens, but adults, teachers, coaches, parents. When conflict is framed as drama, it's easy to step back instead of step in.
Checking in doesn't mean interrogating. It means asking open questions and noticing patterns over time. Who do you feel safe with is often more revealing than, are you being bullied?
Before we close, I think it's important we leave listeners with something practical, not advice in the abstract, but things parents can actually notice and respond to.
And none of this requires being a perfect parent. It's about paying attention to patterns, not single moments.
We already touched on it just moments ago, and that is that one of the biggest signs a teenager is struggling socially is sudden withdrawal, not wanting to go to school, avoiding places they used to enjoy, or spending a lot more time alone without being able to explain why.
Another one is emotional volatility that feels out of character. Big reactions to small things, anger that seems misplaced, or intense sadness that comes and goes without a clear trigger. That's often distress leaking out sideways.
Parents should also watch for changes in how their teen talks about friends, if names disappear from conversation, if group plans suddenly stop, or if your teen keeps going back to social spaces that clearly make them miserable.
And pay attention to language. Teens who are being bullied often don't say, I'm being bullied. They say things like, everyone hates me, I don't matter, or it's always my fault. That kind of self-blame is a red flag.
Another important one is sudden secrecy tied to anxiety, not normal privacy, but panic around phones, group chats, or certain people, especially if it comes with changes in sleep, appetite, or grades.
What helps most isn't interrogation, it's consistency. Checking in regularly, asking open questions like, who do you feel safe with right now? Or, is there anywhere you feel tense going lately?
And if something feels off, trust that instinct. You don't need proof to start a conversation. Early attention can interrupt patterns before they harden.
Reena Virk's story reminds us that social harm often grows quietly. The earlier someone feels seen and supported, the less power isolation has.
And it also raises a question about responsibility. Not just moral responsibility, but legal responsibility. In some places, lawmakers have tried to address bystander silence directly through what are known as Good Samaritan or duty to rescue laws.
Those laws are often misunderstood. They don't require people to put themselves in danger. What they do is set a baseline expectation. If someone is clearly at risk and you can help safely, doing nothing isn't an acceptable option.
In Canada, Quebec is a clear example. Quebec has a legal duty to assist. If you witness someone in serious danger and you can help without risking your own safety, the law expects you to act, even if that simply means calling for help.
That matters, because it reframes inaction. It says walking away isn't neutral when help is possible.
There are similar ideas in parts of the United States as well. Vermont has a limited duty to rescue law that requires people to contact emergency services if someone is in grave danger, as long as doing so doesn't put them at risk.
What those laws really push back against is bystander paralysis, the instinct to assume someone else will step in.
And even where those laws don't exist, the principle still matters. Responsibility doesn't always mean intervening physically. Sometimes it means refusing to ignore what you're seeing and choosing to involve adults or authorities before harm escalates.
Reena's case shows what can happen when silence becomes the default. Laws can't prevent every tragedy, but they can shape how people understand their role when something feels wrong. If this episode made you think differently about teenage social pressure or bystander silence, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Share and subscribe for more true crime that looks beyond the headlines.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Monday on Northern Dark. Until then, take care of each other.